April 17, 1945. The morning air in the village of Kronach, Bavaria, carried the scent of charred wood and wet stone. Spring had arrived, but it brought no color to the streets, only the gray silence of a world collapsing inward. The cobblestones, centuries old, lay cracked beneath the weight of retreating Wehrmacht trucks, their engines coughing black smoke into the pale sky. In the cellars and attics of half-timbered houses, German women and children pressed themselves against cold walls, listening to the rumble of approaching armor. They had been told for years what would come. Now it was here. The first American tank rolled into the village square just after dawn. Its tracks ground over broken glass and scattered roof tiles, the sound echoing off the silent facades. Behind it came the jeeps, the half-tracks, the columns of soldiers in olive drab, their faces young and tired and covered in road dust. But it was not the soldiers who drew the women's eyes as they peered from behind shuttered windows. It was the medics. Men with red crosses painted on their helmets, carrying canvas bags and folding stretchers, moving with a purpose that seemed divorced from the conquest unfolding around them. They did not kick in doors. They did not shout orders in harsh tones. Instead, they knocked. And when no one answered, they waited. In the cellar of a house near the church, a woman named Margaret Schiller held her daughter's hand so tightly the child whimpered. She was 34 years old, a widow since Stalingrad, a mother of 2, and she had not eaten a full meal in 3 weeks. Her son, 12 years old, lay on a straw mattress in the corner, his face flushed with fever, his breathing shallow. Pneumonia, perhaps. Influenza. She did not know. There had been no doctor in Kronach since February. Above them, she heard footsteps. Heavy boots on the wooden floor. Her heart hammered. She thought of the stories. The stories from the East, from the refugees who had come through in January, their eyes hollow, their words unspeakable. She thought of what soldiers did in war. What conquerors did to the conquered. She pulled her daughter closer. Then a voice called down in broken German. "Ist jemand here? Wir sind Sanitator. Medics." A pause. "We help." She did not move. Could not move. The fever had taken her son's strength for days, but now it was fear that paralyzed her. The voice called again, softer this time. And then, something else, a sound she had not heard in years. Laughter. Not cruel, not mocking, but light. Almost embarrassed. One soldier saying something in English, another responding, and then the creak of the cellar door opening just a crack. A flashlight beam cut through the darkness. It found her face. She flinched, raising a hand to shield her eyes. The light lowered immediately. "Sorry," the voice said. "Sorry. We help." "Verstehen." "We help." 2 medics descended the narrow stairs, their hands empty, their movements slow and deliberate. They were young. One could not have been older than 22. He had freckles and red hair and a cross on his helmet that gleamed even in the dim light. The other was older, maybe 30, with a thick mustache and tired eyes. He knelt beside the boy without asking permission, his hands already reaching for the canvas bag slung over his shoulder. He touched the child's forehead, felt for his pulse, listened to his chest with a stethoscope that seemed impossibly clean, impossibly new. He looked up at Margaret. His German was poor, but his meaning was clear. "Sick. Very sick. We take. Hospital. American hospital." She shook her head violently. No, no. They would take him and she would never see him again. That was how it worked. That was how it always worked. But the medic did not move to lift the boy. Instead, he reached into his bag and pulled out a small glass vial. Penicillin. He held it up so she could see the label, the English words she could not read, the red cross stamped on the side. He gestured to the boy, then to the vial, then to himself. Medicine. Good medicine. He will live. She stared at him, at the vial, at the boy's pale face, and then she began to cry. This moment, small, quiet, repeated in 1,000 villages across southern Germany in the spring of 1945, was not supposed to happen. Not according to the narrative that had been carefully constructed over 12 years of Reich propaganda. The Americans, the Bolsheviks of the West, were coming to destroy, to humiliate, to exact revenge for every city bombed, every soldier killed, every year of war. Goebbels had said it. The newsreels had shown it. The whispers in the breadlines had confirmed it. When the enemy arrived, there would be no mercy. And so the women of Germany prepared themselves for the worst. They hid their daughters. They buried their valuables. They swallowed cyanide capsules or threw themselves into rivers rather than face what they believed was coming. But in Kronach and in Weimar and in Bamberg and in 100 other towns whose names have faded from memory, something else happened. The medics came, and they brought medicine, and bandages, and blood plasma, and chocolate bars for the children, and cigarettes for the old men, and a strange, bewildering kindness that shattered the architecture of everything the women had been told. Margaret Schiller watched the red-haired medic inject her son with penicillin. She watched him wrap the boy in a clean American blanket. She watched him smile, an awkward, uncertain smile, and say in halting German, "He will be okay. You will see. Tomorrow, better." And when he left, when the boots clomped back up the stairs and the door closed and the sound of the tanks faded down the street, she sat in the darkness and whispered words she had not spoken since before the war. Danke, danke, danke. She did not know that the medic's name was Thomas Callahan, that he was from a town called Cedar Rapids, Iowa, that he had been a farmer's son before the war, and that he carried a photograph of his younger sister in his helmet liner. She did not know that he had landed at Omaha Beach 11 months earlier, that he had carried wounded men through hedgerows in Normandy, through frozen forests in the Ardennes, through burning streets in the Rhineland. She did not know that he had seen things no 22-year-old should see, that he had held dying boys in his arms and felt their blood soak into his uniform, that he had learned to measure time not in hours but in heartbeats, in breaths, in the seconds between life and death. She did not know any of this, but she knew, in some deep and wordless way, that he had chosen mercy when he could have chosen indifference, and that choice broke something inside her, something that propaganda had built, something that fear had sustained. It broke, and what rushed in to fill the space was a grief so vast and so unbearable that she could not name it. The United States Army Medical Corps entered World War II with a mandate that was as revolutionary as it was logistically staggering: save as many lives as possible, regardless of nationality. This was not sentiment. It was doctrine. The Geneva Convention required the treatment of wounded enemy combatants, yes, but the American approach went further. Field manuals explicitly instructed medics to provide care to civilians in occupied territories, not as a gesture of goodwill, but as a strategic imperative. Healthy populations were stable populations. Stable populations did not breed insurgency. And insurgency, in the spring of 1945, was the nightmare scenario for Allied commanders preparing to govern a shattered Germany. But doctrine on paper and practice in the field are different things. The men of the Medical Corps were not automatons. They were draftees and volunteers, boys from Brooklyn and Birmingham and Bakersfield, who had watched their friends die in the mud of France and the snow of Belgium. They had liberated concentration camps. They had seen the ovens. They had walked through villages where every man, woman, and child had hung white flags from their windows and claimed they had never supported the Nazis, had never known, had never believed. The medics had every reason to hate. Every reason to withhold. Every reason to see the German civilians not as victims but as enablers of the machine that had killed 50 million people. And yet, in the town of Schweinfurt, a medic named Robert Hastings treated a German woman for shrapnel wounds sustained during an American bombing raid. She spat at him, called him a murderer. He cleaned the wound anyway, injected her with morphine, bandaged her leg, and left a packet of sulfa powder with instructions in careful, phonetic German. In the village of Aschaffenburg, a team of medics set up a field hospital in a bombed-out schoolhouse and treated over 200 civilians in 3 days. Elderly men with infected wounds, children with dysentery, women suffering from malnutrition so severe their teeth were loose in their gums. They used American supplies. American blood plasma. American penicillin, which was still so new, so revolutionary, that its production had been ramped up only months earlier to ensure every frontline medic carried vials of the miracle drug. The German women did not understand this. How could they? They had been told that the Americans were barbarians, that they would rape and pillage and burn. The propaganda had been relentless, especially after the fall of France, when Goebbels seized on every real or imagined atrocity committed by Soviet forces in the East and projected it westward. They are all the same, the posters said. They come to destroy the German people. And so when the Americans arrived with stethoscopes instead of rifles, with bandages instead of bayonets, the cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. It was not relief that the women felt first. It was confusion. And then, trembling in the space between what they had expected and what they received, something fragile and dangerous: gratitude. Margaret's son recovered. Within 3 days, the fever broke. Within a week, he was sitting up, eating thin soup that the Americans had provided from their own rations. Within 2 weeks, he was walking. The red-haired medic, Thomas Callahan, returned twice to check on him. The first time, he brought more medicine. The second time, he brought a chocolate bar. He did not stay long. He did not speak much. But he smiled at the boy, and the boy smiled back, and Margaret stood in the doorway and watched this exchange with a feeling she could not name. It was not happiness. It was not even hope. It was something older, something biblical. The breaking of bread. The washing of feet. Mercy as an act of incomprehensible grace. She began to see the Americans differently after that. Not as conquerors, but as something else. Something that did not fit the language she had been given. She watched them distribute food in the village square: canned meat, powdered milk, coffee, flour. She watched them set up a clinic in the old town hall and treat anyone who came. No questions asked, no identification required. She watched them laugh and smoke cigarettes and play cards in the shade of a chestnut tree, and she realized with a start that they were not cruel. They were not vengeful. They were tired. Just as tired as she was. Just as ready for the war to end. One afternoon, she approached the clinic. Her daughter had developed a rash, nothing serious, but it itched terribly and the child could not sleep. An older medic examined the girl, his hands gentle, his expression kind. He gave Margaret a small tin of ointment and a piece of paper with instructions written in English. She could not read it, but she nodded as if she understood. As she turned to leave, he called after her. "Wait." He reached into his bag and pulled out a small cloth pouch. He opened it and offered her a piece of hard candy. "For the girl," he said. "Für das Mädchen." She took it. Her hand shook. She wanted to say something, to thank him, to ask him why he was doing this, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she did something she had not done since her husband's death. She smiled. A real smile. And the medic smiled back. There was a symbolic currency to these exchanges, though neither side could have articulated it at the time. The chocolate bars, the cigarettes, the cans of Spam and packets of coffee, they were more than food. They were proof. Proof of a world that still produced abundance while Germany starved. Proof of an economy that had not collapsed under the weight of total war. Proof, most unsettling of all, that the enemy was stronger not because of cruelty or fanaticism, but because of organization, innovation, and a capacity to care for its soldiers and civilians alike. The German women noticed the little things. The cleanliness of the American uniforms, even after days in the field. The quality of the boots, the leather still supple, the soles still intact. The medics' bags, packed with supplies that seemed endless, bandages that were white and soft, not the rough, reused strips they had known for years, morphine in single-use syringes, not bottles rationed to the point of uselessness, plasma in glass containers that looked like something from a laboratory, not the battlefield. And the food. Always the food. K-rations and C-rations, cans of meat and fruit cocktail and crackers, more calories in a single soldier's daily allotment than a German civilian saw in a week. In the village of Meiningen, a woman named Hilda Brandt watched an American medic open a can of peaches and offer half to a group of children. She had not seen a peach in 4 years. The children stared at the golden slices, swimming in syrup, as if they were looking at treasure. One boy asked if it was real. The medic laughed and nodded. "Real," he said. "From California." The word meant nothing to the children. But the taste, the sweetness, the texture, the impossible luxury of fruit preserved in sugar, that they understood. And in that moment, Hilda felt something collapse inside her. A structure of belief that had held her upright through years of war. If this was the enemy, if this was what the enemy carried in his pockets, then what did that make her? What did that make Germany? The medics themselves were not unaware of the impact they were having. In letters home, they wrote about the strangeness of it, the surrealism of offering aid to the people whose nation had started the war. Corporal James Delgado, a medic from Albuquerque, New Mexico, wrote to his mother in May 1945, "We treated a German woman today. She had a broken arm, maybe from falling during a bombing raid. She kept crying and saying something in German. One of the guys who speaks a little of the language said she was saying, 'This is too kind.' Over and over. 'This is too kind.' I didn't know what to tell her. I just set the bone and gave her a sling. But she looked at me like I'd saved her life. It made me feel strange, Ma. Like maybe she didn't know we weren't here to hurt her. Like maybe she'd been told something different." In another letter, Private Leonard Kuziak from Pittsburgh wrote, "The civilians here are terrified of us. The women hide when we come through. But when they see we're not going to hurt them, they start coming out. Yesterday a little girl brought me a flower. Just a dandelion, nothing special. But she handed it to me and ran away. I still have it pressed in my Bible. I don't know why. Maybe because it reminded me that they're people too. Not just Germans. People." These sentiments were not universal. There were soldiers who refused to help, who saw every German civilian as complicit in the horrors of the camps, the massacres, the years of death. There were officers who issued orders to prioritize American and Allied wounded over enemy civilians. There were medics who worked mechanically, without emotion, doing their duty because it was doctrine but feeling nothing. But there were enough like Callahan and Delgado and Kuziak, enough who chose kindness, who chose to see the humanity in the frightened faces before them, that the collective memory of those weeks became something more than military history. It became a reckoning. The German women, for their part, were caught in a liminal space. They could not reconcile the stories they had been told with the reality they were living. The Americans were supposed to be monsters. But monsters did not give children chocolate. Monsters did not treat fevers. Monsters did not smile awkwardly and try to speak in broken German and leave behind supplies that meant the difference between life and death. And so the women began to question. Quietly at first. In whispers. In glances exchanged over breadlines. If this was a lie, what else had been a lie? If the Americans were not what Goebbels said, then what about the Russians? What about the Jews? What about everything they had believed, everything they had sacrificed, everything they had lost? Margaret Schiller lay awake at night, her children asleep beside her, and tried to make sense of it. She thought of her husband, dead in the frozen wasteland outside Stalingrad, his last letter speaking of duty and honor and the necessity of defending the fatherland. She thought of the rallies she had attended, the speeches she had cheered, the flags she had waved. She thought of the neighbors who had disappeared in the night, the Jewish family who had lived 2 doors down until 1938, the quiet complicity of turning away, of saying nothing, of convincing herself that it was not her problem, not her fault, not her responsibility. And now, here in the ruins of everything, an American boy with red hair and a cross on his helmet had saved her son's life. Without hesitation. Without conditions. Without asking what she had believed or what she had done. She wept. Not from gratitude alone, but from shame. A shame so deep it had no bottom. The penicillin that Thomas Callahan injected into Margaret's son was itself a kind of miracle, though neither of them knew the full story. The drug had been discovered in 1928 by Alexander Fleming, a Scottish bacteriologist, but it was not until the early 1940s that American and British scientists developed methods to mass-produce it. By 1943, penicillin was being manufactured in quantities sufficient to supply the Allied armed forces. By 1944, it was standard issue for every frontline medic. It saved thousands of lives, soldiers who would have died from infected wounds, from pneumonia, from sepsis. And now, in the spring of 1945, it was saving the lives of German civilians. The enemy. The conquered. There was no official policy mandating this. The medics made the choice themselves. They saw a sick child and they acted. They saw a wounded woman and they treated her. They saw suffering and they responded, not because a general told them to, not because it would win hearts and minds, but because it was what they had been trained to do. Because their oaths as medics transcended nationality. Because, in the end, they were human beings confronted with other human beings in pain, and they could not turn away. This was the ideological earthquake. Not the tanks or the bombs or the occupation. But this. The quiet, unglamorous act of caring. Of healing. Of choosing mercy. It undermined everything the Reich had built. The propaganda had painted the Americans as soulless capitalists, as decadent weaklings corrupted by jazz and democracy and racial mixing. But here they were, these boys from Iowa and New Mexico and Pittsburgh, and they were not weak. They were not corrupt. They were competent. They were organized. They were, in a word that Margaret could barely whisper, good. The reckoning came slowly. Not all at once, not in a single moment of clarity, but in the accumulation of small realizations. A chocolate bar. A vial of medicine. A smile. A kindness. And beneath it all, the gnawing question. If we were lied to about this, what else were we lied to about? In the weeks that followed, as the American occupation solidified, the women of Kronach and 1,000 towns like it began to talk. Carefully. Guardedly. They did not speak openly of guilt or complicity, not yet. But they spoke of the Americans, of their strange generosity, of the food they distributed, the clinics they established, the repairs they made to water systems and electrical grids. They spoke of the way the soldiers treated them, not as inferiors, not as enemies, but with a kind of brisk, efficient courtesy that was itself bewildering. They had been told that the Americans viewed them as subhuman. But the Americans acted as if they were just people. Tired, hungry, frightened people. Nothing more. Nothing less. Margaret returned to the clinic several times, sometimes with a legitimate need, a cough, a headache, a question about her daughter's diet, and sometimes just to observe. She watched the medics work. She watched them treat old men who had fought in the Wehrmacht with the same care they gave to children. She watched them joke with each other, share cigarettes, play cards in the courtyard during breaks. She watched them live. And in their living, in their ordinariness, she saw the collapse of a mythology. These were not supermen. They were not devils. They were just men. Young men. Mortal men. Men who missed their homes and their families and who wanted the war to be over just as much as she did. One day, she worked up the courage to speak to the older medic, the one with the mustache who had given her daughter the candy. His name, she had learned, was Arthur Greenfield. He was from a place called Baltimore. She did not know where that was. She asked him, in halting English, why he helped them. Why he did not hate them. He looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he said, in slow, deliberate German, "Because you are not the war. You are just people. Caught in the war." It was the simplest answer, and the most devastating. By June, the war in Europe was over. Hitler was dead. Berlin had fallen. The machinery of the Reich had collapsed into rubble and ash. In Kronach, the Americans remained, but the urgency of occupation gave way to routine. The medics continued their work, now joined by military government officers, engineers, and relief organizations. Life, in its broken, provisional way, resumed. Margaret's son grew stronger. Her daughter's rash healed. The village began to rebuild, slowly, painfully, but it began. Thomas Callahan was transferred to another unit in late June. He did not say goodbye. He simply stopped appearing at the clinic. Margaret learned from another medic that he had been reassigned to the Pacific Theater. She never saw him again. She never learned if he survived the war. She never had the chance to tell him what his kindness had meant. But she kept the empty vial of penicillin he had used on her son. She kept it on a shelf in the kitchen, next to a photograph of her husband. Two objects. Two men. Two worlds. One dead. One alive. One who had believed in the lies. One who had lived the truth. Years later, when Germany had been divided and rebuilt, when the Marshall Plan had poured billions into reconstruction, when the Federal Republic had emerged as a democratic state bound to the West, Margaret would sometimes take down that vial and hold it. She would think of the red-haired boy from Iowa. She would think of the moment he knelt beside her son, his hands steady, his face kind. She would think of the words he had spoken in broken German, "He will be okay. You will see." And she would weep, not from gratitude alone, not from shame alone, but from the unbearable weight of understanding, of knowing that mercy had been offered when none was deserved, that kindness had been given when none was expected, that the enemy had turned out to be the savior. There is a photograph, taken in the summer of 1945, somewhere in Bavaria. The identity of the photographer is unknown. The location is not recorded, but the image remains. It shows a young American medic, his helmet off, his sleeves rolled up, sitting on the steps of a bombed-out building. Beside him is a German woman, her face lined and worn, her hands folded in her lap. Between them is a child, maybe 4 years old, eating a piece of chocolate. The medic is smiling. The woman is not. She is looking at the medic with an expression that is impossible to describe. It is not happiness. It is not relief. It is something deeper. something that exists in the space between collapse and rebuilding, between guilt and grace, between the world that was and the world that might yet be. This photograph was never published in newspapers. It was never used in propaganda. It was found decades later in a box of uncatalogued images, donated to a university archive by the estate of a veteran who never spoke about the war. But the photograph tells a story. It tells the story of Margaret Schiller and Thomas Callahan and a million other encounters like theirs. It tells the story of a moment when the machinery of war was forced to confront the humanity it had tried so hard to destroy. And in that confrontation, something shifted. Not immediately, not completely, but enough. Enough that a woman in a cellar could watch her son heal and know that the world was more complex than the lies she had been told. Enough that a medic from Iowa could offer a vial of penicillin to a child whose father had fought for Hitler and feel no contradiction. Enough that the act of healing, small and unglamorous and repeated 1,000 times in 1,000 villages, became a kind of revolution. Not a revolution of ideology or politics or grand historical forces, but a revolution of the human heart, a recognition, trembling and fragile, that mercy was possible, that kindness was real, that even in the ruins of the most destructive war in human history, there were moments when people chose to be good. The symbolic weight of the penicillin, the chocolate, the clean bandages, it cannot be overstated. These were not just objects. They were evidence. Evidence of a society that had not been consumed by war. Evidence of an economy that could produce miracles. Evidence of a value system that placed human life above revenge. The German women saw this evidence and could not unsee it. They held it in their hands. They tasted it. They felt it heal their children. And in doing so, they were forced to confront the central lie of National Socialism. That strength came from cruelty, that power came from domination, that the future belonged to those who were willing to be ruthless. But here, in the wreckage of the 1,000-year Reich, was a different kind of strength. A strength that built hospitals instead of concentration camps. A strength that fed the hungry instead of starving them. A strength that healed instead of harming. And this strength, this quiet, unglamorous, bureaucratic strength, was winning. Not just the war, but the peace. Not just the battles, but the hearts. Margaret understood this, even if she could not articulate it. She understood that the Americans had defeated Germany not just with tanks and planes and bombs, but with something more insidious. With generosity. With competence, with a vision of the world that was not built on hierarchy and hate, but on the radical idea that all people, even the enemy, had value. It was this idea, more than any weapon, that broke the back of fascism. Not because it was imposed at gunpoint, but because it was demonstrated, quietly and persistently, in 10,000 small acts of care. In the decades that followed, Germany would undergo a transformation unlike any in modern history. From the ashes of total defeat, a democracy would emerge. A prosperous, peaceful, stable democracy bound to the West by choice, not coercion. Historians would debate the reasons: the Marshall Plan, the Cold War, the division of Germany, the trials at Nuremberg. All of these mattered. All of these played a role. But there was another factor, harder to quantify, harder to measure in statistics or treaties or economic data. It was the memory of those first weeks. The memory of the medics. The memory of the chocolate bars and the penicillin and the quiet, unexpected kindness. Margaret Schiller lived until 1987. She never left Bavaria. She never spoke publicly about the war. But she told her children, and her children told their children. And in this way, the story survived. The story of the red-haired medic who saved her son. The story of the moment when everything she had believed shattered and something new, something fragile, took its place. The story of trembling in the presence of grace. There is a truth here, buried in the ruins of 1945, that transcends history. It is the truth that mercy is stronger than hate. That kindness, however small, however unglamorous, has the power to transform. That the enemy, when treated as human, becomes human again. This was the lesson the German women learned in the spring of 1945. It was a lesson bought with blood and ash and the collapse of every certainty they had known. But it was real, and it endured. The medics did not think of themselves as heroes. They did their jobs. They followed their training. They treated the wounded, distributed medicine, moved on to the next village. But in doing so, they did something more. They planted seeds. Seeds of doubt. Seeds of hope. Seeds of a different world. A world where strength was measured not by the ability to destroy, but by the capacity to heal. Where power came not from domination, but from service. Where the highest expression of victory was not humiliation, but restoration. This was the world the women glimpsed in the eyes of the medics. It was a world they had been told did not exist. A world their leaders had mocked as weak, as decadent, as doomed. But it was real. And it was here. And it was offering them a vial of penicillin, a chocolate bar, a smile. And in accepting these gifts, they accepted something else. A possibility. A future. A chance. April 17, 1945. A cellar in Kronach. A woman. A medic. A child. And between them, the quiet miracle of healing. It was not the end of the story. It was not even the beginning. But it was a moment. A moment when the world paused, just for a heartbeat, and chose mercy over vengeance. Kindness over cruelty. Life over death. And in that moment, everything changed. "This is too kind," the women said. Over and over. In German, in broken English, in whispers and tears. "This is too kind." They were right. It was. That was the point.